Hey everyone, my name is Paula MacLean and welcome. And what I want to share with you are some of the better practices that will help your board on its journey to go from, well, maybe messy to magnificent, or perhaps a pretty good board and just making that board greater as time goes on. You know, as a consultant to the not-for-profit world for the last almost 30 years, and as a former executive director and a many-time board member, one of the biggest challenges that our boards face is really about understanding the concept of being a policy board or a governance board, and distinguishing that from an operational board. Now, operational boards are not lesser, or they're just different. And what we really have when we have an operational board is an organization that often has very few staff, maybe one or two part-time staff. Operational boards tend to be hands-on, they tend to be grassroots, and the work of the organization is being done largely by the volunteers of the organization. That's why we often call an operational board, also is often called a working board. So in the concept of board governance, there's another type of board, and that's called a policy board, sometimes also called a governance board, and those two things tend to get used kind of interchangeably. They're kind of synonymous. So one of the things we're going to talk about in the first of our videos is how do we sort out the difference when something comes forward that we think the board might need to address or deal with. Is that thing operational, or is that governance? Now, in the executive coaching that I do, this is a very common question. It often comes to me in an email, either from a board member or from an executive director. And the question is, this issue, Paula, that I'm struggling with, well, should it go to the board? Should it not go to the board? Is it mine as an executive director? Does it belong to the world of policy? And so it's challenging very often, whether you're a paid staff, senior staff member, or whether or not you're a volunteer, it's challenging to try to figure out what is the difference between what is governance and what is operational. So I want to walk you through 6 pretty simple scenarios, but they're pretty common scenarios. They're all real life examples of stuff that has come to me. And we're going to talk about each one of those scenarios and find out which is operational and which is governance. Very important for the board to make a decision what kind of board it's going to be. So if it's a policy board, it should have, in fact, a board motion that says we're a policy board. That helps board members and the executive director understand that this is a statement of the board model that we have chosen. That doesn't necessarily make it all crystal clear whether or not we are supposed to deal with certain issues. And what it helps us have our board members stay to the governance role, stay in the policy-driven kind of role, and it also gives a little bit more clarity for the senior staff of the organization in terms of figuring out what goes to the board and what doesn't go to the board. You know, sometimes board members will wander inadvertently into operational areas, even though we've made a clear statement in a board motion that we are a policy board. And that's kind of understandable. Most board members in their career, in their working life, are operational people, the jobs that they do. And very often they come right from their job right into a board meeting. So they're in an operational mode. It is absolutely normal and pretty understandable when a board member inadvertently wanders into operations and asks a question or makes a statement that is actually operational rather than policy oriented. Now, the other part of this is occasionally we'll have a board member, and you know who they are, maybe 1 or 2 people on some boards that you've worked on in the past or even now, who are what I call the meddlesome Mollies or the meddlesome Mikes. Apologies to all of the Mollies and Mikes who are watching this video. But the real reality of that is that they know fully what is operational and what is policy, and yet they deliberately want to involve themselves in the operational work of the organization. This is a tough situation, so we need to be clear on this so that the board can give board members feedback and say, nope, Mike or Molly, this is something that we're not going to be dealing with as a board. So the board has to be assertive, it has to be clear, and it has to be prepared to give feedback feedback to board members who are wandering either intentionally or unintentionally into the work of the senior staff of the organization. Now, I want you to take a few minutes either now, you can stop the video, or at the end of the video, and have a conversation about, are we a policy board? Are we operational board? If that's all perfectly clear to you, then you can skip that area. But I do want to encourage you to continue to have dialogues at your board meetings when issues come forward to say, this might be a gray area. If it's not clearly operational or not clearly policy, the conversation needs to be an open part of the way you continue to clarify the nature of the board's work. So let's dive in. I'm going to walk you quickly through 6 different scenarios. The first scenario is that a board member asks for a copy of the org chart. Well, this is neither operational nor governance. It's a perfectly reasonable request. The org chart should exist in both the new board member orientation package as well as in the board binder. And that org chart obviously should be updated when the organizational structure changes. And the other thing I would like to recommend is that you spend a few minutes at a board meeting, and certainly with brand new board members as well, talking about that structure. Who reports to whom? How many people does each person supervise? What are the structure in terms of the programs and the services, and how are we divided up, and how do we organize our work? It is really helpful for the board to understand the nature and structure of the organization. It helps understand workloads, it helps understand the reporting lines. Just a really good idea to have that conversation. Second scenario is that a board member asks not for the org chart, but for a copy of the benefit package. Well, clearly this is operational. The first question that I would want to ask of this board member is, what's their interest? Sometimes they're asking because they might work for an organization in a role where they might be involved with benefit package administration, or they might work in the insurance industry. And they might be a broker for the kinds of things that benefit packages cover. And so this is clearly not something that we should be sharing with our board members. However, by the way, they also might be a financial person who's wondering, are we getting good value for money? Are the premiums reasonable? What are we paying out every year? And so those are kinds of the genesis behind why a board member might ask a question. So clear that up by asking the question first. Secondly, whenever you are managing benefits, once every 2 or 3, sometimes 4 or 5 years, we actually should be doing benefit package reviews. And make a mental note that this board member, who has clearly an interest and some expertise, could be asked to serve as a volunteer consultant to a committee that is doing the benefit package review. It's a great way of involving a board member with a specific skill set and asking them to consult to the organization as a volunteer. So that clarifies the whole operational nature, but it also engages a board member to share their expertise in a way that will really benefit the organization. Situation number 3 is a board member asks what a specific employee or perhaps a group of employees is earning. So they want specific individual kind of compensation information. Clearly this is operational, and clearly we don't want to share confidential personnel information such as compensation. However, let me give you a suggestion that will clear this up and that will give you a response if a board member asks that kind of question. Take a 1-page or 2-page list of all of your position descriptions inside your organization and their salary range, either hourly, monthly, it can be annual, so usually 5 steps or 7 steps on the range, and give that to the board with the annual operating budget. So when the board approves the annual operating budget, they are in fact also approving the pay scales inside the organization. So when the board member asks the question, you can remind them that attached to the operating budget are the pay scales for everyone in the organization by position, but not by individual specific ranking on those pay scales. So what is important also here is to understand that the question might be being asked of the executive director about their own compensation. And of course, the board has every right to know exactly what the executive director is being paid, including their base salary, compensation around professional development, mileage allowances, vehicle allowances, those kinds of things, all part of the package. So if the board member is actually asking about the executive director's compensation, then that is a governance thing and the information should be shared very openly. Let's go to situation number 4. A board member suggests that a committee be struck to look into employee morale. Well, right on the surface, you know this is operational. And most good organizations are doing annual staff satisfaction surveys. So to make this a governance practice, what's important is the board pass a motion or contain within its bigger package of governance policies a requirement that on a regular basis, usually annually, that management conduct an employee satisfaction or employee engagement survey, and that a summary of the results of that survey comes back to the board together with an action plan from management to address any of the issues that might require attention, that might be concerns that are expressed by employees who responded to the survey. So that's a really important way of kind of managing. We'll talk in video number 3, we'll talk about trust but verify, but it's a great way of the board trusting the executive director and senior staff to do their jobs, but also verifying that we have this happy core group of staff who work for our organization. Now, the other part that's important here is a measure of employee morale or satisfaction is the results of a 360-degree performance appraisal that is done by the board of directors, usually again annually. It might be done every 2 or 3 years, depends on your size of your organization and the policies that you have. But a 360-degree performance appraisal looks at the 360 degrees, the circle around the executive director, and says of all of the people that are reporting directly to her or him, of all of our current board members, of all of our funders, of some of the program staff who work for the organization, are they happy with the leadership of the executive director? And we ask a series of questions using a survey format usually that gets to gather up some information on a fairly regular basis that goes to the board, and then the conversation at the board level is to say, do we have a happy group of people? So even though employee morale and setting a committee is not an appropriate request, what you can see is there are appropriate ways under a governance model of engaging the board in the process of ensuring that employee morale is something that is high and that people are for the most part happy. And by the way, don't fool yourself. You will never have, if you have 100 staff, you will never have 100 happy people. If you have 10 staff, you will never have 10 entirely happy people. So that's not our goal, but we want the majority to be reasonably happy. Okay, let's go on to situation number 5. Annual general meeting is coming up. The executive director has asked 3 people to come onto the board. The board has no nominating committee this year. Well, in some ways you can understand why the executive director kind of had to fill out the board complement. However, this is a great example of the executive director doing the board's work. And this is a governance responsibility. Now, the challenge here is if the board doesn't do it, the ED will step up. However, it is the board's job with the support of the executive director to ensure that we have a governance policy in place that is pretty specific about how will we go about recruitment. How do we plan for the succession of the leadership of the organization at a board level? So the executive director's job is actually to support the board in building a governance policy. Again, it can be a single motion of the board or it can be part of your overall bigger governance policy package. But the job here of the executive director is to support the board and say we need a recruitment process, and to be a reminder to the board of saying, you know what, we need a recruitment committee. And here's a little tip. It's a really good idea to not be setting your nomination or your recruitment committee a month or 2 ahead of your annual general meeting. Make this a year-round committee. Give it different responsibilities every 3 months. So 1 month it might do some planning around board development and training. Another month it might be doing its recruitment. Another month it might be doing orientation. So we call this the 4 quarters of board governance, and there's a module in the full Great Boards video course that talks about how we can organize this so that it's done in advance, that when we get to the annual general meeting it's just a smooth sail, it's a no-brainer, and we've got the new nominees. Now, here is a problem, is that if the board defaults on this responsibility and the executive director picks up the ball, is that we are actually unintentionally, inadvertently weakening the status of the board in 2 ways. First of all, all, the board is not doing its job. And secondly, the executive director could in fact stack the board with friends, people that she knows, colleagues, people who are her supporters. And this can create a really unhealthy dynamic down the road. How do those people do a performance appraisal? How do those people who are friends of the ED critique his or her work? So pretty important that the executive director not step up and kind of nudge the board, encourage the board, show the board how that board can take care of the recruitment or nomination process itself. Now, the executive director may be asked by a nomination committee or recruitment committee to, in fact, suggest names, and there's no reason why those names could not be brought forward. And in fact, taking that idea a little bit more broadly, all senior staff could be asked to present names of people that they feel would be good candidates for the board. The board needs to still vet and consider and interview and weigh the skill sets against the board's objectives, and must be very careful that we don't walk into the whole area of conflict of interest. All right, final is the situation number 6. On a recent tour with a new board member of organizational services, an employee complained that a toilet was constantly running and had not been repaired. Well, this is an operational issue. That one's not hard to figure out, but the question is, how does a board member manage that situation? First thing is for the board member to say, have you reported it? Have you filled out the form? Have you asked for it to be fixed? And obviously, if the staff member said, no, I haven't, then the board member should simply say, well, figure out who you need to talk to about that and make that happen so that this gets fixed. If the staff member says, yeah, I reported it 3 weeks ago, and then I reported it again and nothing has happened, then the board member might say something like, well, you know what? Probably a good idea to talk to your manager or talk to somebody more senior and just say, we got a toilet running here, it's wasting water, it's causing a problem, it makes a noise, whatever the issue is, and I've reported it twice or 3 times and it's not been fixed. Could you kind of get on this? And then the third thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the executive director is aware. As an executive director, one of my greatest fears is that I would not know about some of the smaller, simpler things that I could fix in a heartbeat, that I could make happen today, but that nobody was letting me know that we had a problem. So the executive director will probably not run out and fix the toilet herself, although in small organizations it has been done. I personally have fixed agency toilets. So it's not likely the ED is responsible for that. However, the ED is responsible for ensuring things get done. All managers' jobs are to solve problems, and the executive director will make a phone call, send a text, send an email, and get on this so that it is solved. So it will be appreciated by the executive director if the board member sends a courteous follow-up note, either an email, a text message, or a phone call that just simply says, did you know you got a running toilet over here? And a staff member was concerned and complained to me about it. So that builds and supports the relationship between the executive director and the board member and says, board member, as a board member, I understand my role. Executive director will feel that they've got a good board member who is being communicative and helpful when they hear a concern. All right, I want to give you the magic question to help sort out this whole, is it governance, is it operational kind of situation. When you're faced with an item on the agenda, a problem, an issue that's coming forward, and you want to figure out, do I take this to the board? Does it belong at a board meeting or not? Here's your magic question. Is this issue an arms around issue or a fingers in issue? And what I mean by that is that effective boards, great boards, put their arms around the organization. They embrace the organization at a governance level, and they do not put their fingers in the organization. You'll be surprised how easy it is to answer that question when you come with a very specific issue. And even when you're in shades of gray, it's okay to have that conversation. Even if to some board members it's absolutely obvious that it's one or the other, operational or governance related, it's still okay to have that conversation. So ask the question when something comes forward, is this an arms around thing we're talking about, meaning it belongs to the board and it's a governance or policy issue, or is it a fingers in issue, meaning it belongs to management of the organization to resolve? That's it for our first training videos, and I wish you well on your governance journey. Bye for now.